Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
In 1789, George Washington was elected our first president. He was re-elected for a second term in 1792. Since then, every 4 years, Americans have elected a president of the United States. How do we choose our president? What does a person have to do to become president? What does a president do? Well, those are just a few of the questions we'll answer in this program. Let's start right at the beginning. According to our Constitution, power is divided among 3 branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. No one branch can work without the cooperation of the others, so no one branch can become too powerful. The legislative branch, called Congress, passes the laws. The judicial branch, headed by the Supreme Court, decides if the laws agree with the provisions of the Constitution. The executive branch, headed by the President, sees that the laws are carried out. The President is also the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. There's also a vice president who can take over if the president dies or is unable to hold office. Both the president and the vice president are elected to 4-year terms. There are only 3 qualifications for becoming president. The person has to be a natural-born citizen of the United States, at least 35 years of age, and must have lived in the United States for at least 14 years. That's it. So how do you get to be president? You win an election, of course. In fact, you have to win a lot of elections. You're probably familiar with the big election that takes place in November, the one where all the registered voters can vote. That's called the popular or general election. But you might be surprised to learn that it isn't the official election required by the Constitution. So, let's take a look at that. At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the delegates debated long and hard about how to elect the president. Some thought it should be up to Congress. Others thought it was a job for the states. Still, others considered having the people elect the president directly. But in those days, it was very hard for people to get information, and many thought that the general public wouldn't be informed enough to make a good decision. In the end, the writers of the Constitution came up with a compromise: have each state choose a few people, called electors, to do the electing. That way, the citizens would have a say, but the electors would be well informed about the candidates and the issues. The electors all together are called the Electoral College. Here's how the Electoral College works. Each state gets a number of electors equal to its representation in Congress. That means the number of senators, which is always 2, plus the number of representatives in the House of Representatives. The number of representatives a state has is based on its population, so the greater the population of a state, the more electoral votes it has. That gets to be important. You'll see why in a minute. The Constitution leaves it to each state to decide how to choose their electors. Today, in most states, the candidate for president who wins the popular or general election gets all the state's electoral votes. But here's the odd thing. The candidate who gets the most popular votes isn't guaranteed to get the most electoral votes. In fact, in 1888, President Grover Cleveland, who was running for re-election, got over 95,000 more votes than his opponent, Benjamin Harrison. But Harrison's votes came from bigger states with a lot of electoral votes. so he beat Cleveland, 233 to 168. But how does the Electoral College actually decide on the president? Well, the electors meet in their own state in December after the November general election. Originally, each elector cast 2 ballots. Whoever received the greatest number of votes was named president. The runner-up was named vice president. It didn't take long to figure out that that wasn't such a good idea. Here's what happened. In the election of 1800, the country's 3rd election, the majority of electors wanted Thomas Jefferson to be president and Aaron Burr to be vice president. But because each elector cast 2 ballots, Jefferson and Burr each received the same number of electoral votes. So Congress had to decide who the winner was. They voted 36 times, and finally, Congress named Jefferson president and Burr vice president. To make sure that never happened again, in 1804, the 12th Amendment was added to the Constitution. It says that the electors will cast just 1 ballot, but they will put down 2 names, one for president and one for vice president. And that's a system we still have today. But there's more to it than just receiving the most electoral votes. To be named president, the candidate has to get a majority, more than half of the votes of the Electoral College. If no candidate gets a majority, then the election has to be decided by Congress, and that has happened twice in the past. But first, let's talk about the road a candidate for president has to travel to get to the general election and to the Electoral College. It's almost impossible to talk about presidential elections without talking about political parties. A political party is a group of people who have similar ideas about government. Back when George Washington was elected president, there were no political parties. In the first 2 elections, Washington received every single electoral vote. Not so surprising, he didn't have any opponents. That never happened again. In every election since, there have been at least 2 candidates, each representing a different party and a different view of how the government should be run. The first 2 political parties in America were the Federalists, who believed in a strong federal government, and the Democratic Republicans, who thought the state should have more control. In the election of 1796, these 2 parties faced each other for the first time. The candidates were John Adams for the Federalists and Thomas Jefferson for the Democratic Republicans. That year, Adams won. In the next election, 1800, Jefferson defeated Adams. Throughout our nation's history, there have been many political parties. Since the 1850s, the 2 major political parties have been the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Each party has a symbol. The Republicans are represented by an elephant, the Democrats by a donkey. There have also been third parties that last for a while and then fade away. So in some presidential elections, there are more than 2 candidates running for president. Today, anyone who hopes to be a candidate for president has to get their party's nomination. But before they can be nominated by their party, they have to win a lot of smaller elections. Let's look at that process. Being well known or already holding an office like a governor or a senator or representative is important for anyone who wants to become president. Once a person declares that he or she is a candidate for president, they have to test how much support they have within their party. So they go to each state to find out. Most states use one of 2 systems to decide how much support a candidate has: a caucus or a primary. A caucus is a meeting where members of the same political party get together, in this case, to choose a presidential nominee. A primary is an election where people vote for who they want to receive the party's nomination. A candidate who doesn't do well in the early primaries and caucuses usually drops out of the presidential race. Those candidates who do get a lot of votes usually stay on, and their main job is to raise money from donations and get even more support for their campaigns. Most of the primaries and caucuses start at the beginning of the election year and continue until the parties hold their national conventions. Sometime during the summer of the election year, each party holds its national convention. That's where delegates from every state get together and select the party's presidential candidate. Banners, posters, balloons, hats, buttons, and music add to the excitement of the national conventions. After nominating speeches, the chairman of the convention reads the roll call of each state. Then the delegates cast votes for the candidates they want. The way they vote is usually determined by the result of the state's caucus or primary. Sometimes the candidate is chosen on the first ballot. Sometimes it takes many, many ballots. But eventually, one candidate wins the party's nomination. After that, the delegates vote for a candidate for vice president, usually a person the presidential nominee has chosen. The two candidates together, the presidential candidate and the vice presidential candidate, are called the party's ticket. Also, at each convention, the delegates vote on the party's policies and political views. This statement is called a platform. The convention usually ends with a rousing speech from the nominees to get up everyone's enthusiasm. From there, the election contest really gets going as the candidates take their campaigns to the voters. How do presidential candidates let people know who they are and what they stand for? The answer is through a nationwide campaign. Today, it takes thousands of people and millions of dollars to run a presidential campaign. But it wasn't always like that. Up until the mid-1800s, most candidates didn't campaign for themselves. Campaign supporters did all the work. They used banners and buttons and parades and rallies just as they do today to drum up support from the voters. When the railroads were built, that made it possible for the candidates to bring their campaigns closer to the people, and many presidential candidates did that. William McKinley wasn't one of them, though. When he ran for president in 1896, McKinley never left his front porch. Anyone who wanted to see him had to come to Ohio. Meanwhile, his Democratic opponent, William Jennings Bryan, traveled all over the country by train, thousands of miles, speaking to nearly 5 million voters. But it didn't help him. McKinley won anyway. No candidate after that ever just sat on the front porch. They all went out to meet the people. Candidates like Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Harry Truman would travel around by train, stop at different places, and speak to the crowds from the back of their railroad cars. These became known as whistle-stop campaigns. Soon, airplanes took over. In 1960, Richard Nixon became the first candidate to campaign in every state, including Alaska and Hawaii. In 1996, in an effort to get closer to the people, Bill Clinton went back to the old ways and traveled around parts of the country by bus. That way, he could meet people close up and really talk to them. From the very start, presidential campaigns used advertising and newspapers to spread their message. Next came radio, then television, and now the internet. In 1960, John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon faced each other in the first debate that was ever on television. Since then, televised debates have become an important part of the campaign. And where does all the campaigning lead? To the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, when millions of Americans all across the country go to the polls and vote for President and Vice President of the United States. Let's go back and review the steps that it takes to get to the White House. First, the candidate has to win a political party's nomination. That means winning primaries and caucuses and being declared the nominee at the national convention. Then, the candidate takes the campaign to the people. Then, there's a general election in November, followed by the Electoral College vote in December. The candidate who gets a majority of the electoral votes is declared president. Today, that means 270 of the 538 electoral votes. Why 538? Well, 100 for the 100 senators, 435 for the 435 members of the House of Representatives, and 3 for the electoral votes from the District of Columbia. But what happens if no one gets a majority? Well, then the election is decided by Congress. That's happened twice in our history. The first time was in 1824 when there were 4 candidates for president: Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, William H. Crawford, and Henry Clay. When the votes were counted, Jackson had the most popular votes and the most electoral votes, but not a majority. According to the Constitution, the House of Representatives has to decide among the 3 candidates with the highest number of votes. After a lot of wheeling and dealing, John Quincy Adams was named president. The next time was in 1876. Samuel J. Tilden, the Democratic candidate, had 250,000 more popular votes than his Republican opponent, Rutherford B. Hayes. And Tilden only needed 1 more electoral vote to have a majority. Hayes was far behind. He needed 14 votes to be declared the winner. Problem was that 14 electoral votes were in question. So, Congress created a special commission to figure out what to do about those 14 votes. In the end, it was decided that the votes should be counted, and all 14 went to the man we know as President Rutherford B. Hayes. So Tilden lost, even though 250,000 more voters wanted him to be president. Of course, we've also had presidents who were never elected to that office. John Tyler, Millard Fillmore, Andrew Johnson, and Chester Arthur were vice presidents who moved into the White House when the sitting president died. Other vice presidents became president that way, but they went on to win election in their own right. And then there's Gerald Ford, who is the only president to have never won a national election. Here's why. In 1973, the vice president, Spiro T. Agnew, resigned from office before the end of his term. Under the 25th Amendment, Congress had to elect a new vice president. They picked Gerald Ford. Then, in 1974, when Richard Nixon resigned the presidency, Ford moved into the White House. But he didn't win re-election at the end of that term. That's just one of the many interesting facts about the presidents. Here's some more. Did you know that Zachary Taylor, Ulysses S. Grant, William Howard Taft, Herbert Hoover, and Dwight D. Eisenhower were only elected to one office, President of the United States? After they left office, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Johnson both served in Congress, Adams in the House, Johnson the Senate. William Howard Taft lost his bid for re-election in 1912, but served as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court from 1921 to 1930. William Henry Harrison had the shortest term of office. He died 1 month after his inauguration. John Tyler, the vice president, became the first person in that office to succeed to the presidency. Because of that, many people referred to Tyler as his accidency. The teddy bear is named after Theodore Roosevelt, who was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 5th cousin. John Adams and John Quincy Adams were father and son. Congressman John Scott Harrison is the only person who was both the father and son of a president. William Henry Harrison was his father, and Benjamin Harrison his son. And here's one more fact to remember, probably the most essential thing you need to know. One of the most important duties of every citizen is to vote. But unfortunately, in the United States today, the country with the freest elections in the world, the oldest government of the people, by the people, and for the people on earth, many citizens do not vote. But there's something you can do about that. Even though you aren't old enough yet, you can still encourage others to vote. So do what you can to get people to go to the polls. See ya in November.